know, for the last 2 weeks, we've been buried under ice and snow, and I am glad to have green ground once again, you know, so that we can do our normal things. And I want to assure you that it's much easier to have church than it is to cancel it. Canceling church is a pain, if you haven't noticed. There are all these people who have to be notified, and the call thing has to go out, and the email has to go out, and the sermon has to be recorded, and it all has to be done just to call off what we do best, you know? What we do best is what we do every Sunday. My grandmama, who was a country woman from North Carolina, used to say, you know, Mrs. Duggins up the street, why, she's the salt of the earth. As a child, I knew that was supposed to be a good thing, to be the salt of the earth, but aside from that, I wasn't sure why it was a good thing to be salt, you know? And I had no idea that the phrase, the salt of the earth, came out of the Bible from Jesus, specifically from our passage from Matthew today. We say things like, well, I gotta pick on somebody. You know Dennis back there, he's a salty old cuss, isn't he? You know, we say things like that about, mostly about older people in our parish. You could say about me, I suppose. And we say, you know, that Johnson boy is not worth the salt it would take to get rid of him. You know, like putting salt on the slug on the sidewalk. By the way, we've been saying that someone isn't worth their salt since Gaius Petronius first said it in 66 AD. And we've been taking things with a grain of salt since Pliny the Elder first coined that phrase around 79 AD. So we've been talking about salt for a long time. We've been talking about salt ever since Jesus' time. But what is so important about salt? Why is it so important to be the salt of the earth? Well, we know that salt gives bland things flavor. It even makes sweet things taste sweeter. The same grandmother who talked about Mrs. Duggins up the street used to put salt on her watermelon in the summer because she said it made it taste sweeter. So salt keeps things interesting. And the salt of the earth makes ordinary bland world into an interesting experience. In the Bible, Job asked, can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt? You know, have you ever tried to eat oatmeal or popcorn without salt? It's just pitiful. And those salt-free potato chips, I'm so sorry. They're just not good. In the Old Testament, salt was sprinkled on both grain offerings and burnt offerings when they were offered at the temple. And the prophet Ezekiel talks about rubbing a newborn baby with salt as a way of keeping them healthy and driving away demons. Salt also preserves things from spoiling. It keeps things edible, as those of us who eat bacon and country ham and chipped beef and corned beef all know salt is important. And so the salt of the earth preserves things from spoiling. In the Bible, Elisha purified the spring at Jericho with salt in 2 Kings. And permanent covenants were referred to in the book of Numbers as covenants of salts, because eating salt with someone meant to be bound to them in loyalty. You know, we get our word companionship about from eating bread with somebody come and eating bread with somebody, because that binds us together. Eating together does, as all of us who went to breakfast know. So, from all these biblical references and ancient references to salt, we can tell that to be the salt of the earth means to be the people who give the world flavor, to be the people who help keep the world healthy, to be the people who preserve the earth from spoiling, to be the people who purify, and to be people who are steadfast in loyalty. That's pretty important. But even more than any of these things, when I was in the Middle East at St. George's College in Jerusalem almost 40 years ago, I received a teaching about salt that even is more important. Here, with our abundant wealth and prosperity, we think of salt in our diet as more of a problem than a blessing. Here, it elevates blood pressure, it causes water retention, and it's something our doctors tell us to cut back on. Cut back on that salt. I never realized until I went to Israel and down into Egypt the importance of salt. In August of 1987, long before many of you were born in this room, when my group from St. George's College in Jerusalem went south, we went down over the border from Israel to Egypt and headed for the Sinai Desert. We left a brand new Mercedes-Benz air-conditioned bus with closed-circuit television, which for 1987 was pretty amazing, you understand, and went over the border into Egypt, where cars and vehicles from Israel were not allowed to pass. So we climbed out of that brand new, beautiful Mercedes-Benz bus and climbed into about 5 or 6 ramshackle, old Toyota Land Rovers. Now, these were not the Toyota Land Rovers that you see in the Toyota dealer today. These were not the Land Rovers that had, for example, the luxury of sides, and the luxury of a roof overhead. They didn't have air conditioning or any of those luxurious things. There were no reclining seats in these things and no warm seats to keep your tushy warm in the wintertime. There was none of that stuff. They had no walls, they had no roof, they had no sides, they had no seats in the back. What we had for seats were 2x4s that were strapped across the back, and in a concession to luxury, they were covered with uncushioned vinyl. The seats that was just to keep you from getting splinters, but there was nothing else. There were metal roll bars over our heads, and on top of the metal roll bar, there was a canvas tarp that had been tied down to the roll bars. Our drivers were Bedouin men who had traded in their old camels for these swifter and more efficient Toyotas. The Bedouin drivers took great delight in the fact that as consummate drivers and navigators, they avoided paved roads whenever possible. No paved roads. We would be going down a paved road and all of a sudden, you're out in the sand. You're going through the sand of the desert. And instead of a road, there would be mountains on either side of the sand wadi that you were going down. They would use these wadis in the middle of the mountains like interstate highways going through the Sinai wilderness. Of course, they weren't paved like interstate highways. They were rough and they were bumpy. And believe me, your tushy ached and your back was in pain riding over these things. And that was when I was like 30-something. This was a long time ago, as you can tell. So, as you went along, the temperatures there reached about 125 in the middle of the day in the Sinai. This was August in the Sinai wilderness in Egypt. And there was no shade for hundreds of miles in any direction. Even the lizards and the scorpions and stuff, even they went in holes during this time of day, because nobody except mad dogs and Englishmen would be out in the noonday sun there. And as you went along, going between 30 and 60 miles an hour with the growing pain in your back and in your bottom, coupled with the desperate desire not to fall out of the side of the Jeep, mind you, because it was nothing to hold on to much. You were focused on holding on to those little vinyl-covered wooden 2x4s that you were sitting on. And we were told, and the bodies, I forgot to say, this was a convoy of Jeeps. And so the first Jeep, Toyota Land Rovers, so the first Land Rover threw up sand, and the rest of the Land Rovers behind him were the recipients of the sand that the Land Rovers in front threw up. So you were covered with, it was like sitting in your clothes dryer and being sandblasted while you were sitting inside your clothes dryer. Okay, you get the picture. We were covered in grit The Westerners were miserable, but the Bedouins were having great fun driving through the wadis. Before we left Jerusalem, the staff at St. George's, told us that while we were in the desert, we had to drink a quart of water every daylight hour. A quart an hour, that was the rule. And we carried these things that looked like plastic gasoline cans, except they had water in them. Now, lest you think that it was nice, filtered, cool water. This is not nice, filtered, cool water. To refill our water carriers, they had big water carriers on the backs of the Land Rovers too, but to refill our water carriers, we would stop at these oases. And at the oases, the Bedouins would pull up with their camels. They would take this old rusty paint bucket, throw it down the well, bring it up, set it on the ground, and the camel would drink out of it. And then they would take the same rusty paint bucket, throw it down the well, pull it up, and we refilled our water carriers. And it was nasty, brown, disgusting, camel spit filled water. It was just awful. It was awful. And we had to drink a quart of that stuff every daylight hour. If you think about that, that's 48 to 64 8-ounce glasses of water a day. A ridiculous amount of water. And the water was just disgusting. And even consuming this preposterous amount of water, at the end of the day, you would go to relieve yourself and nothing would come out. You know, we lost so much water through our skin and through evaporation that nothing was being filtered through our kidneys in the normal way of getting rid of water. It was amazing. Now, when you sweat, you not only lose water, you also lose salt. And we ate more salt that week than you would normally eat in a year. They told us everything your doctor and cardiologist tells you to do the opposite of when you're here. Eat salt on everything, with everything, dumped on everything. We had feta cheese, salty. We had sardines, salty. We had olives and brine, salty. We had salted nuts. We had salt sprinkled on our rough, round loaves of bread, which never saw the inside of a plastic bag. Loaves of bread, they just come in piles, stacked up like round piles, and they are. I mean, it's like they put the hay from the barn in the bread over there. It's just not good at all. And we dumped salt on that too. They said, eat salt on everything you can stand, and still it was not enough salt. If you don't get enough salt or you don't get enough water, guess what you get? Dysentery. That's what you get. The first sign of dehydration is dysentery, and the very fluid that you so desperately try to hold onto is flying out of you. And everybody on that trip got dysentery the first day in the desert, and we all saw each other burn our toilet paper, because that's the only way to get rid of it in the desert. You have to burn it. And we learned how much salt and water we needed. So we did what they told us to do. And we ate salt until it came out of our ears and drank gallons of that nasty brown hot water, and we got better. But there was one fellow in our group from New Zealand who could not stand to drink that much hot, nasty water and eat that much salt. And instead of better, he got worse. After the dysentery, he became nauseated. And so he was losing fluid from both ends of his body. He lost what little salt and fluid he had in him, literally from both ends, and became mentally disoriented and belligerent. That's what happens when you lose your salt. You go crazy, you go wacky. And finally, he became too weak to put up a fuss. And at that point, the St. George's staff was able to get salt and water in him without too much of a fuss, so that he got better. If they had not been able to do that, there would have been an air ambulance to come and pick him up and give him bags of saline, which is salt. Right. Bags of saline, because that's the next thing they do, and it's the last step they can do for you before you die. Wow. It was from that experience that I learned how important salt is. I learned firsthand that when Jesus says, you're the salt of the earth, he wasn't talking about Fort Mill, South Carolina in 2026. He was talking about the desert in the Holy Land, where salt is absolutely necessary for life. He just didn't mean that we, salt of the earth, provide flavor for the world. He didn't mean that we preserve the world like a country ham. He didn't mean that we purify the world like the Jewish people use salt. To the people of the Middle East, salt is a necessity to live. Without it, the world loses all of its life-giving fluids. It becomes deranged and crazy. Eventually, it collapses, loses its strength, dries up, and dies. That's what the salt of the earth means. And that's how important it is to be the salt of the earth. That's how important the mission of the church was then and is to this day. First of all, despite what it says in the gospel, salt doesn't lose its saltiness. Salt, I'm told by all chemists, if it has no saltiness, it never was salt to begin with. Saltiness goes to the essence of what it is. And that's the way it is with Christians. Christianity of every Christian goes to the essence of who we are. Or put another way, if the center of our lives is not being God's arms and legs in this world doing God's work, then we have lost our identity. Wow. We're the salt that loses its saltiness. Similarly, can you imagine a world that has no light? Not just the power going out, but all the light going out, bumbling around in total darkness, inadvertently falling over everything, one disaster after another. That's how crucial the mission of the early church was then and is to this day. So we must be about the business of being salt and light, about doing God's good works in this world. In a nation and in a world that is so very deeply divided right now, it's more important than ever to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world in this world and in the nation where the events of every day happen as a surprise of what new parade of horribles can come along. You know, in that world, we've got to be the salt and we've got to be the light. And it's important for us not to fall into that division and dissension. Instead, right now, it's important for us to think globally and to act locally. I thought of that term as a modern concept because I just heard it not too many years ago, but I discovered that that term dates back to Patrick Geddes in 1915. It's 110 years old. We've been trying to think locally, think globally, and act locally for 110 years now. You'd think we'd learn how to do it by now, wouldn't you? We think globally by considering the long-term worldwide impact of what we do. And we act locally by looking for sustainable, practical solutions to problems in our own local communities. If you want to see a particularly prominent example of that, consider the Buddhist monks and their walk for peace. These are Vietnamese-born monks who lived in a monastery in Fort Worth, Texas, who are walking to Washington, D.C. Can you think of anything more unlikely than born in Vietnam, live in Fort Worth, walking for peace to Washington? Their soft-spoken leader, Thich Nhat Hanh, is a former Motorola engineer who now walks barefoot in the cold. You know, that's what he's doing. Sometimes he wears shoes. And Aloka, their rescue dog, comes from India, of all places, you know. The walk is to promote national healing, unity, and compassion during this divisive time. They've walked 100 days through 10 states, and on Tuesday of this week, in 2 days, if all goes well, they will arrive at the National Cathedral for an interfaith welcome service for everyone. They currently have over 1 million followers on social media, this little group of people. That's pretty much acting locally and thinking globally, isn't it? On a smaller scale, on Wednesday this past week, Ernest and I went to our favorite Greasy Spoon for lunch. It's called the Circle G restaurant, and it's on Beatty'sford Road in Charlotte. It's been there for 70 years, and if you want country cooking in the middle of the city, that's where to go. And so we went there for lunch, and a lady at the next table opened up her pocketbook, pulled out reusable containers that she had brought from home for her leftovers. She did that while I used a styrofoam box and felt guilty. You know? She was thinking locally, globally, at the impact of styrofoam and acting locally on what she could do about it. And I was so ashamed that I did not think of bringing my own reusable to-go box, you know? So, let each one of us try to live our lives imitating how Jesus lived, trying to do what he would do, trying to speak the words of comfort and love that he would say, and most of all, love one another the way Jesus would love us all, reducing, reusing, recycling the things that might pollute the earth, being radiators of God's love instead of drain, sucking it all away. For you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Without you, the world would simply dry up, shrivel away, and die without life-giving moisture in the dark. That's an image, isn't it? And the world desperately needs each one of us to be God's light and God's salt, to preserve the earth and illuminate the darkness of these days. Amen.